This week on The Sceptic, I speak to Ed West, historian and author of the Wrong Side of History substack, on the arrest of Graham Linehan, the Asylum hotel protests, and the scourge of so-called colourblind casting.
It's called colourblind casting, but it's obviously very colour conscious. For example, it wouldn't be done the other way around. Filmmakers, they pay a lot of attention to costumes, to settings, all to add to the authenticity. And at the same time, they include characters who could not conceivably do that. It's an anachronism, a deliberate anachronism for political reasons.
And for our premium subscribers, I speak to Stephen Tucker, author and Daily Sceptic columnist, on the authoritarian schemes of the Green fanatics, like infecting people with tick bites to make us allergic to meat.
They really did have a plan, which sounds completely made up and invented, whereby there's a type of tick, and it appears to be possible to genetically modify it to allow it to spread allergic reactions to meat or to dairy products, and also certain medicines. So there's not much that can go wrong there, is there?
Hello and welcome to episode 49 of The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic. And I'm very pleased to be joined today here in the studio by Ed West, who is a historian and the author of the very acclaimed Wrong Side of History substack.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, welcome to The Sceptic, Ed.
It's a pleasure.
Okay, so Graham Linehan is the story we're going to start with. I mean, you and I have written about and discussed the parlous state of free speech in Britain for a long time, and there would have been plenty of other things for us to discuss, not least Lucy Connolly, of course. But this has happened it happened on Monday, but the news broke yesterday of course, the acclaimed writer of Father Ted and the IT Crowd and various other really excellent comedy shows, latterly becoming a sort of gender-critical campaigner, and who has actually also gone to America to really pursue his career there, because actually it's been so difficult for him to get ahead in comedy anymore in Britain because of his stances, arriving back to Heathrow on Monday and being immediately arrested by 5 armed police over 3 tweets he had sent a few months previously. So, well, I mean, just to start with, Ed, what do you make of this just absolutely extraordinary moment?
It does seem like a right-wing fever dream, doesn't it? I know people like us have talked about it in the past, and there have been lots of cases of people, in some cases, going to jail for jokes on WhatsApp groups, or the police turning up at their door because of something they said, which are often quite innocuous, often at the behest of kind of organised campaigns. But trans activists tend to be the most organised, and we sort of go on about this, and free speech has become this kind of supposedly right wing thing. And then this case comes up, which just seems sort of like a clear case of overreach. I mean, in fact, they're armed. He's sort of a man in his 50s. He's not going to, he's not taking down in that way. Glenn there, as he's become known as, like some of my age growing up, I would have known him. Father Ted and the IT Crowd and Black Books was another great comedy, and he also featured in the Alan Partridge series. He was this kind of great figure from the mainstream of comedy, and he's sort of like one of these figures in revolutions who's among the new revolutionaries who turns against it, because he was quite a sort of prominent left-winger on Twitter once in a while. I mean, it seems strange now. I remember writing an article about Spectator sort of criticising he was saying how conservatives have sort of no feelings or something, which might be true. But then he became the kind of great campaigner against the kind of excesses of the trans movement, became a very sort of outspoken, gender-critical campaigner, and I think along the way, he's alienated even some of his allies, I suppose, in that case. So, he's a man with very strongly held opinions, and he tweets stuff which has its own certain style. But I mean, if you look at the actual tweets, I mean, can we repeat them, or we'll
I think we can? Yeah,
I can't actually remember off the top of my head, but he's talking about if a man turns up in a women's loo, kick him in the balls or something like that.
Yes, exactly.
I just don't think anyone could look at those and think those go beyond regular, levels of Twitter rage into sort of criminal matter. I mean, you see hundreds of tweets that are much worse than that. I mean, I've received far more threatening tweets than that. I mean, Twitter has obviously no mechanism these days for actually, doing anything about it. But the police would never get involved. And then people get sort of even sort of death threats that aren't investigated by police, but they've managed to get involved on account of these 3 pretty innocuous tweets. And the timing is obviously amazing because Nigel Farage is in the States, and this issue has become a kind of hot topic among friends I know who are either in America or speak to Americans, say this is a subject that comes up a lot. Britain has become a bit of a cautionary tale. They can't understand how people are going to jail for stuff or being arrested. It just seems to them very bizarre. I mean, obviously, America's kind of an outlier, very unusual in having free speech. Most countries don't have their tradition of free speech. You get on the spectrum. There's a country like Germany where there's always been laws against saying things. Whether pro-Nazi or pro-communist, you could always end up going in jail, or parties being banned. And then the other end is the United States, with the First Amendment, which protects even speech, which people in Britain would find very shocking. But in Britain, over the last few years, it has become more and more obvious that this thing is kind of completely out of control. It's partly the law, the Communications Act, which we've all talked about before, is the most sort of egregious example of it. But also the police don't seem to know what they're doing in some cases. They seem to be taking, it's like in sort of ideological regimes where the leader comes up with this rule and everyone below him tries to sort of outdo the others by making the most absurd kind of overreach of the system. And in this case, it seems, I'm not a legal expert by any means, it seems that the police weren't actually following the law in the correct way. It's not like the law was bad. It was like they didn't have the capacity to do this and still went ahead. And one of the many things people are asking is, what were they thinking? Who's making these decisions? Why are they in public office? And where is the mechanism for getting rid of them if they're going to do stuff like that? Because it's pretty shocking.
Yes, but I think one of the things that's been interesting, of course, you say it's not clear whether they were actually within the law to charge him with this, and which particular, I don't actually recall which charge it is that he's been done under, but nevertheless there are so many different ones he could have been sort of tagged for, and it's been interesting to see in the past day where Streeting, for instance, has come out and said actually we should change the law if it's operating in this way. And similarly, there's been some sort of somewhat loose attempts by Number 10, for instance, to distance the government from this and say, well, we would think the police's priorities should be burglaries and so on, and not tweets. But it seems to me that actually, if the government sets the environment and priorities for the police, what's really relevant is what they did last summer. Because, of course, you had, from the Prime Minister, from the Attorney General, this narrative that what was happening online had to be taken very, very seriously by the CPS, by the courts, by the police, and that this could materially cause riots or anything else. And so it seems to me to be really quite hypocritical that they're now saying, oh, well, the police, I can't believe the police are being so authoritarian here, when actually this is politicians' responsibility, surely.
I think it comes down to whether you believe that speech leads to violence. These laws are created originally with the intent of protecting minorities from incitement to violence. So I don't think even the most pro, free speech people wouldn't say, someone can say, oh, wait, I think we should go down and burn down a mosque or a synagogue. With the thing, with the Lucy Conant thing, I agree she should have got a criminal record for that. I just think the jail was completely excessive in the heat of the moment. I'm probably, more authoritarian than you. The question is, how much of this butterfly effect do you think actually happens if someone starts saying things which are critical of a particular group or a particular religion or a particular lifestyle? How much do you think that's actually going to endanger them? The only person so far, I think, who's actually justified this behaviour is the new Green Party leader, who's specifically said, trans people need protection. It's that kind of language of, a group needs protection from any kind of criticism, basically. That's de facto what it means. Because otherwise there would just be, this hatred. We talk, lots of these organisations, they say, they're campaigning against hate. That's the thing, right? And hate just means, I don't particularly like this subsection of society, but I'm not going to do anything harmful to them. But I'd like to have the right to criticise them. So if your whole thing is that you must eradicate hate, then of course we can't have free speech, because it's just incompatible. And with the trans thing in particular, it's an issue which causes a lot of anger. I don't think that the both sides of ism is fair, because there's been, from what's clear, is that the trans activists have been much more, they use much more violent languages, and some of their opponents have become much more extreme, but it is clearly a reaction to them. And we've seen at previous protests lots of very, very violent imagery, specifically aimed at J.K. Rowling, who is a particular target. She's obviously must feel that there are lots of people who want to attack her. But the more extreme trans activists seem to be very organised, seem to be very knowledgeable about how the law works in particular, and are very organised in the way that they kind of bombard the authorities with complaints, and the authorities feel like, well, we've got to deal with that, rather than having the actual wisdom and leadership to say, no, don't be stupid. Obviously it's a stupid thing. I'm not sending 5 armed policemen down to arrest a comedian. That would be mad. And that comes down to a failing. I mean, the law is a problem. I mean, obviously the Communications Act, which is the worst one, is like incredibly badly. It's ambiguously phrased in the way which is obviously going to lead to overreach if you're causing distress and alarm. I mean, what does that mean? And that's the one that's leading to lots and lots of cases. I do feel like my one point of optimism is that I think the embarrassment it causes internationally is a good thing. I think it's good to embarrass the country in this sense. It's unfortunate that, so far it's mainly been Republicans who talk about it, and the kind of Republicans that British people hate, so they can convince themselves, oh, yes, actually right, Donald Trump's against it, J.D. Vance is against it, then it must be good. But I think more and more Americans in the mainstream are now saying, actually, Britain's quite screwed. Like, they talk about, they must feel, thank God they actually had that revolution, because now, otherwise it'd be terrible.
Yes, and I think that is one of the ongoing headaches, really, for Starmer in particular. Every time
he's got so many headaches right now.
Well, true, but every time, so there's a trade deal coming up, every time he gets in a room with Trump or Vance, they're needling him over this issue. And of course, as we've been saying, Farage is going to be testifying to Congress about this today. What do you make of I guess that dynamic? But is that going to ramp up the pressure on them, do you think? In particular, just all the different ways, and whether it's through the trade deal, whether it's just through these pronouncements, whether it's through the State Department, for instance, releasing reports which say that there's been backsliding on censorship in Britain.
Right.
Is that going to have an effect?
I think it's bound to. I don't know how much. I don't know the ins and outs of the trade, and whether and also Trump's psychology, whether he actually going to make this a kind of condition. It obviously causes a problem when the US-based tech companies are put under pressure to, implement restrictions, because the Americans take the kind of obvious view that we're much richer than you, so we're not going to sort of be pushed around this way. If there are material pressures they can bring to use, then that will change it. I'm not sure whether just having reports or is gonna have much of an influence, because if American conservatives are attacking Labour, I mean, they're so unpopular now. I mean, they can probably do all the friends they can get, but I don't think that's going to have a huge effect. I mean, we should also mention that the government's authoritarianism doesn't just affect the right. I mean, their treatment of Palestinian action activists has been completely over the top in my view as well. I think it's legitimate to take legal action against people who engage in sabotage, for example, but people proclaiming their support for a group who engage in sabotage, that should not be a crime. So I just think they have a sort of natural tendency to feel that it should be the law's job to, clamp down on supposedly extreme groups who threaten the system. But obviously, kind of right-wing nationalists are the biggest problem for them. As was made clear after the riots last year, they do view that as the number one threat to the system, so to think.
And I suppose if the Labour government did want to, as Wes Streeting has sort of indicated, try and reform this, or at least be held less responsible for these gross overreaches of speech, I think perhaps what they don't really understand is that they can't just sort of throw out a few comments here and there and maybe one or two proposals. They actually would need to do a lot to reform an entire policing culture and change several laws. And I don't think it's really understood the extent to which the system as it currently operates just necessarily creates these ridiculous outcomes.
Right. I mean, they do have the power. The Home Secretary can sack police officers, so they can say if anyone's responsible for these kind of overreach examples, we can do something about it. But within the police force, there are so many networks and systems set up, which kind of give the impression that their job is to combat prejudice rather than stop criminals. So if there's a culture like that, we saw it with the response to the grooming gangs, that if there is a culture in which if you are seen as not being on board on these issues, your career is basically over, then it's obviously natural instincts that people aren't going. You don't want to be the person who's going to be accused of institutional transphobia because you haven't taken these really serious problems seriously. There's much more of an incentive for you to be the person who actually goes to the other extremes. And there isn't really a mechanism where, if you're a police, if you're in charge of a police authority and you get accused of institutional racism or whatever, then, that's really bad news for you. If burglaries go up 10%, that doesn't really make much difference to your career in the same way. So I think there are so many institutional incentives. The law would take a long time to change, but I think it should be eventually. It feels like they're setting up what they believe and saying we're not actually on board with all this, but they're not going to do anything about the actual course of it.
Yeah, it's something we've spoken about before, but this does seem to be very much in the long shadow of Stephen Lawrence and the Macpherson report,
right,
where you actually now sort of 25 years almost after that, you have the almost entirely institutionally anti-racist police. And so even if what was interesting actually was with Graham Linehan, actually he reported that the police themselves, or some of the officers, were fairly sort of apologetic about.
I'm sure they are. I'm sure loads of them are very embarrassed about it.
But nevertheless, these are coming from the top. This is what it feels it has to do. One key institution here is the College of Policing, brought in 2014, which really advanced that idea of non-crime hate incidents. But that's very much going back to what you're saying about this idea that any kind of negative comment towards a minority group is sort of on a spectrum with genocide at the other end. And
yeah, it's the pyramid, isn't it? They love the pyramid, and at the bottom is sort of mansplaining, and the top is like literally, mass murder.
Yeah.
The politicization of police. When the police started going around with, pride flags, and it was another one of those things like, why does that bother you, sort of things like, well, they're just celebrating, love, whatever. When the police start signalling their political views, even if it's a celebration that no one wants to sort of openly say they dislike in any way, then you are eroding their authority amongst the population, because they are obviously signalling which side. Like if the police force does go around with pride flags, then it's obviously not that logical they end up arresting someone for criticising transgender activists. It's kind of on the par. It should be without fear or favour, and no one would at all think. It comes down the two-tier thing. No one would at all think that if the shoe is on the other foot, someone would be arrested for saying that. People have made all sorts of really, really kind of nasty and kind of violently languaged threats against gender critical feminists, and it just kind of goes. The strange thing is, I wonder, would the police? The police, if they arrested, then they should arrest J.K. Rowling, really, but they just know that would be too embarrassing. Harry Potter's like what must be a huge percentage of our tourism income now, but it doesn't really make sense. I feel sorry for him. He said a heart blood pressure of 200 by the end of it. I'm not surprised. It's embarrassing.
No, I suppose it's also a statement that the fact that he had to essentially leave Britain to pursue his comedy career. So he's written this Father Ted musical,
which has been in progress for years, hasn't it?
Well, I think it's been written for a long time, but
right.
he, the company would not do it with him because of his trans stances,
right.
And so he's refusing to take his name off it and be bought out for a paycheck, and so it's sort of in limbo.
It is noticeable how few. I don't know him, so and I can see why he's obviously a forceful character with strong views, but almost no one comes to his defence. It's just really high noon stuff, which is, what sort of everyone secretly supports you, but I don't want to be the person.
Well, I think increasingly now, though, I mean, that is interesting, though. I think he actually has criticised J.K. Rowling for not defending him earlier on. But I think nowadays, I mean, obviously the trans issue has gone on a whole kind of cycle, and he is more. I mean, obviously this has become a great cause célèbre in the past few days, right? I think he's more defended by the right, at least now.
Oh yeah, he's entirely. The right love him. Which, as I said earlier, is a kind of strange sort of circumstances. His career arc has been his character arc, I should say, has been. We shouldn't forget the fact. It comes down to he's an enormously talented writer of comedy, and he produced some of the great comedy of the 90s and noughties. And it must be very sad that so many friendships have obviously been broken as a result of this issue. And I wonder what people think in private. That kind of subject always interesting.
Okay, so let's move on to a related topic, but also about the sort of warped priorities of the state. And that's the illegal migration crisis and the protests that have been happening all this summer, really. And so, of course, we've had this. In fact, the ruling is not necessarily that significant, but it's the permission for the Home Office to appeal the planning ruling about the Epping Bell Hotel that there have been all these protests at. I suppose, what have you made of the whole saga? But in particular, I thought it was very striking last week that basically the Home Office had to come in and join this lawsuit and make these arguments very, very explicitly that the ECHR and their duties to asylum seekers under it directly took precedence over the interests and safety of the people of Epping. And I mean, that just has to be very damaging, don't you think?
Yeah, it always comes back to that quote David Goodhart he made about, was it Gus O'Donnell? I can't remember his name. Was this the civil servant? And he said, my priorities are for the well-being of the globe rather than the population of Britain. And people at this Oxford's high table sort of agreed with it. And I mean, I'm sure that is the attitude and the worldview, and they're sort of saying it out loud, which isn't very helpful. I mean, they're obviously they're basically completely snookered because there's nothing they can do short of leaving international human rights refugee conventions, the various ones that will stop that. The process of migration and chain migration now is so large, and it's beyond what people really can understand, because there's conventions. The Refugee Convention goes back to 1951, and it deals with basically the resettlement of the Germans who were expelled in Europe. And the world was about 2 billion people. There wasn't that great communication. Telecommunications were very primitive compared to now. There wasn't the capacity for large numbers of people to move. We live in a vastly more heavily populated world. People can move in huge numbers, and migration follows certain patterns. Once as a sort of a community established, cousins and more distant relatives arrive, and so the current system just allows such a large number of people to continually come to Britain. The incentives are so strong they can quite easily come, and if they cross by boat, there is a risk of death. There is a risk that they might not be accepted. But in Britain, the odds are very good, and it's very much worth it. So those people will just keep on coming, unless there is a plausible chance that they will not be allowed here. So the numbers are just going to keep on going up and up, and they have to go somewhere. So the hotels aren't popular, and the other thing is it's social. They put them in housing, and that's not popular either. In some cases, basically force people to sell up, or and once they're put in housing, you can't even keep an eye on them. So, and there have been a number of cases there have been a few murder cases, lots more cases of rape and sexual assault. And as everywhere, the state has been very kind of about the details. But from what we know, from the rough numbers, the number of crimes committed by asylum seekers, the unvetted men who arrive, is considerably higher, even accounting for age-adjusted calculations, than the population at large. These are negatively selected people. And because they come from countries where they couldn't get tourist visas, they arrive from the most chaotic and dysfunctional societies on earth, much more likely to be involved in crime, and much more likely to be an economic drain on the country in the long term. It makes really, really no sense to keep the current system. It's a really, really bad for us that we are continually attracting people like this. And obviously no one wants them. And, it's kind of a system where sort of the norm is they tend to be moved to poorer areas because it doesn't really make sense. It wouldn't make sense to put them up in Knightsbridge. But then you're creating the kind of you're adding to the general sense that if you are, poor, we're just going to sort of dump these problems on you, and then we're going to continue feeling great about ourselves because we're doing our international, duty when it doesn't affect us. It's just, there is no way out for this for them where they, won't be hated. And even though illegal migration is a relatively small percentage of all migration, it's by far the most unpopular, but for obvious reasons, because people don't want random, unvetted men living them, and the fact is it is mostly young men who are by far the most dangerous section of society. If you look throughout history, this is how, if in any society in history, lots of young men aged between 18 and 30 turn up in your town without your permission. It's really bad news for you. And, this is the same. I mean, I can think my own personal anecdote. I mean, when my eldest daughter reached year 6 at school, primary school, which is 10 to 11, when a lot of people let their children walk to school alone. I was very nervous because there'd been a case of a man trying to abduct primary school age children from our area in North London. He was convicted. It turned out he had previously been jailed for an incredibly brutal rape. He'd been let out 4 or 5 years later, and then he'd gone on to try to abduct girls, and he lived in our area. And he was an asylum seeker, but he was able to use human rights laws to stay here. And he's now served enough time that he's almost certainly back in the community, and he's probably living near me. And I just think this does kind of concern me, not every day, but this is... So when people say, well, don't you care about human rights? Say, well, okay, the positive right to remain in someone else's country, even if you are committed terrible crimes, counters with my right to... freedom from attack, and freedom from worry. And obviously these things have to be countered. The system is so dysfunctional that the worse you are as a person, the more likely you are to be able to stay. There's the case of the alcoholic from Pakistan who was a sort of paedophile, and he can't go back because that's stigmatized. Oh, of course it's stigmatized. And also he wouldn't be, because alcohol will be banned. Probably a good idea in this case. But there have been a number of cases. I've actually drawn up a list of them. There have been so many, and I haven't got around to it. It was originally ready last summer, and I thought I better delay this in case these riots get really bad. I don't want to feel the fame. And I keep meaning to post it, but it's just such a depressing, endless list of failures by the system that we let this guy out and he goes and does something terrible. So people have got every right to be upset about it, especially in the Epping case. A 14-year-old girl was assaulted. I can't remember the phrasing they used for it, but it sounded almost... it was none of this kind of clunky, kind of late Soviet phrasing that the authorities use. It was like an unfortunate incident or something like that. It's like, well, no, it wasn't. It was a 14-year-old girl. It's horrible, and it's completely preventable. But they are not prepared to do what is necessary, and also they do have some. They should have some of the blame for preventing Rwanda, which would at least have been
a deterrent.
Exactly, it would just been it would have said we are serious about this, and the numbers would have gone down, and they were against it partly for maybe cynical reasons, partly thought it wasn't. This is who we are as a country. Is that kind of silly argument? Oh, it made me feel so bad about Britain if we just refused random people who turn up to live here.
Absolutely. And it does seem to me that there's a parallel here actually with the free speech issue, where you have some are saying, oh, we've always been a country with free speech, and sort of batting it away and saying that they actually support it, but not having any idea of actually how to take on the whole system which is producing these outcomes. And likewise, you have Yvette Cooper saying, oh, we'd like to close all the asylum hotels. And it's like, okay, but do you want to leave the ECHR? Do you want to, move them to a camp rather than, Epping or wherever
with all
else?
the bad ops and not a good look, criticism you're going to get for that. And you're going to have to be very unpopular. You're going to have to kind of, iron in your belly for that. And they're not prepared to do. The latest thing was... we'll prevent the families of asylum seekers coming here, but that will be disputed by the courts, and they know it will be disputed, and they know because of the Human Rights Act they will lose that one, and they're still going about it. The latest thing is, this sounds very nice. Firstly, 6 Palestinian children who are going to be treated here, and then Palestinian students from Gaza. This is going to lead to chain migration. It's undoubtedly going to lead to chain migration. And it's probably, in terms of the level of risk for future terror outcomes, chain migration from Gaza is probably the highest you can possibly imagine. It will be up there with Libya. And it's completely forgotten that we've rescued a number of people from war-torn Libya, and that led to the Manchester massacre, and it led to the Reading killings of 3 men were killed, and it's just disastrous. And there is no way out except for withdrawing from the treaties, which I think is the European Convention on Human Rights. I think it's almost certainly the case we will leave at some point, and in which case I think other countries in Europe will just start doing it as well.
And I think therefore it's very, very important to make the point and again that the government are actually making political choices here, even by inaction, even by not being willing to reform these things or to leave the ECHR, and that therefore, as they showed so much last week and continue to show with their response to the asylum hotels crisis, that actually the present state of affairs is de facto what they want. This is what they're choosing.
It's the path of least resistance.
Yeah.
Because leaving ESHR would be really hard. It would cause a lot of anger amongst their own, in their own party. Starmer, as we know himself, has this strange, almost robotic loyalty to international law, we saw with the Chagos Islands thing, which no one can really understand. And he very much comes from that kind of circle. It's much easier just to force this hotel. Hopefully the weather's getting better. The protests, they're hoping. The weather's getting worse. Sorry,
yeah.
Which is better for the government. They're hoping the sort of protests will naturally die down. People will kind of accept it, because if one area is able to force the government to close their hotels, then it obviously sets a terrible precedent, and they can't allow that to happen. They have to put the people somewhere, and the numbers are growing. So. It's the path of least resistance, and that's what they're going to pursue.
Yes, okay. Well, let's talk about the protests a bit then. Of course, that's been the feature of really the whole summer. I suppose, what have you made of the difference between the protests this time and last year? And I suppose in particular, partly their nature in itself, but also the way they've been covered, the way they've been reacted to, because of course, there was that constant denunciation of them essentially as far right last year. We haven't been having that anywhere near as much, and I think they have actually wised up a bit themselves in their optics. But I suppose, what have you made of that and the significance of it, and do you think it's going to continue?
I don't know. I wasn't there either. First to say last year's protests were riots. I wouldn't even. Obviously, they had a political element, but they were disorderly and in some cases violent. And if you looked at the people who were convicted with the actual action involved, it was lots of them had multiple convictions for petty crime. Almost all of them were drunk. It was basically the underclass who were at least caught anyway. That doesn't seem to be the impression of the people this year. It seems like a broader section of society. Lots of women, which always make complete difference to the kind of the dynamic of any sort of protest. I think that probably reflects the fact that it has the anger at the issue probably has a much wider level of support than it probably. It did before. There is this sort of rule that once protests sort of gather steam, they tend to get more middle class, or at least once you've got lots of attractive young women at the front, then you're basically going to win, because it's kind of reached a level of social acceptability. I don't think it's the case with these kind of things, but it's definitely it seems to be, from what I've seen, and I haven't been there. It seems to be a kind of a sort of broader spectrum of society. Having said that, there have been one or two extreme right-wing activists from what I know on them. But I suppose they're always going to turn up at these things, aren't they? What else are you going to do?
I suppose so. And also one interesting feature of this summer has also been the police. Questions last summer over whether it was two-tier policing or not. But I think there's been a lot more focus this time. How do you think there's been any difference between the response? Of course, we had that kind of paradigmatic moment in Epping when they were seen to lead the Stand Up to Racism protesters into the middle.
Yeah, that was very weird. I didn't really. Why did they bring those people down to the protest?
That's a good question. But so they originally denied having done it. But essentially they then claimed that they have to facilitate free speech, and that this included...
Well, I mean, the police famously love free speech in Britain.
which was particularly
name.
extraordinary, come from Essex Police, which had doorstepped Alison Pearson, for instance.
Right.
And anyway, it was a bit of it was certainly a fiasco, and I think lots of people are much more aware of the potential for this two-tier policing, and there's, it's very interesting to note that on Sunday, at one of the protests in Epping after that ruling, there were 3 arrests of several prominent campaigners, and there's been a lot of controversy over that. 2 of them have so far been charged with minor offences, I think. But Essex Police was really anxious to say, oh, no, we didn't arrest her for, this particular activist, for waving the Union flag outside the Civic Centre.
Right.
It was actually just for breaking the, I think, Section 14 order, which said you're not allowed to protest in the Civic Centre, which I don't think anybody knew about, so it was pretty unfair. But I think it's interesting that the police feel so much pressure to try and show that they're not being two-tier, even though everyone continues to criticise them.
It's funny, but because a lot of these complaints now are made by sort of people of our political persuasion, this is what the hard left have been saying for ages, that the state views them as a threat and an enemy in the way that it doesn't necessarily view other protesters, and it's sort of geared up to crushing them, often using quite... Britain does have quite strong... I mean, dating back to Margaret Thatcher in particular, the police do have quite strong powers in these kind of situations. Mm-hmm. And I suppose conservatives in the past would just say, oh, it's just a bunch of crusties getting it's kettled, whatever. And now there is definitely a sense that the state does view this kind of sort of native nationalism as its kind of primary threat. In a way, I don't think, even with the Palestinian protests, I mean, I think, of last year anyway, now since they've sort of basically banned one group and sort of banned some forms of protest, but there was a sense of, they're sort of allowed to get away with quite a lot, because it's not really a threat to the British system in the same way. It's obviously it's extreme, but it's not the enemy. While people, there was the image of someone trying to put up the Union Jack, wasn't it? And it was, and it sort of looks like that's quite a subversive thing to do. And you wouldn't sort of arrest someone. Obviously, the Pride flag, you wouldn't arrest someone for taking down the flag, right? I mean, you'd be mad as a policeman to do that. But it has kind of this subversive symbolism now.
Yes, well, I mean, let's get on to that. I mean, so yes, obviously there's that at the protests, but there has now been this emergent phenomenon of flagging up and down the country, of people doing it on roundabouts, for instance, with the St George's Cross and elsewhere. And one of the salient things is that in places like Tower Hamlets and Birmingham, which have been flying Palestine flags for months and months and months, quite happily, suddenly there's an imperative to take them down for road safety, apparently.
That was Birmingham, wasn't it? Someone might hurt themselves. Yes. The driver might be distracted or something. I don't know.
How interesting has, I guess, that the reaction of the state as well, but also just the fact. Why do you think people are feeling the need to do this, and what's its significance?
The flagging thing seems to start just south of Birmingham. I think, didn't it? It was just a few people started putting them up as.
There was a group in York as well, but
now they've taken on them much more. So Birmingham has had lots of Palestinian flags in sort of various areas, and they did say, we would need police protection to take down these flags because the local community might get annoyed, and that was Tower Hamlets. That was their rationale as well. They had Palestinian flags up everywhere for quite a long time, but the leader of Tower Hamlets, which is run by this kind of independent, sort of Bengali-dominated Aspire party. He said that, it was a symbol of solidarity with the world's poor and justice, and et cetera, et cetera. Tower Hamlets is, I suppose, it's about 40% Muslim, about 30% Bangladeshi. It's sort of white British population is very small. I think it's like the 4th smallest in the whole country, but very concentrated mainly towards the east, which is where these kind of St George's crosses started going up, and they immediately took these down. And said there was sort of some sort of threat to cohesion. Birmingham likewise took them down. It was in the same week they sort of put the Pakistani colours on the library to celebrate Independence Day of that country. So it obviously gives the impression that some forms of national expression are considered okay, and some are considered threats. And the Palestinian flag obviously means different things in different places. There are lots of flags, you won't see it in most Arab countries because you'll get arrested. It has a sort of an anti-regime message there, and in a sort of nice middle-class area of London, or Glastonbury, it sort of symbolises kind of solidarity with the globally oppressed, or I'm left wing or whatever. But in parts of the country which are in districts which are heavily Muslim, it has a kind of territorial feel. People have shopkeepers have openly said that they feel like they have to put it up because there could be threats otherwise. So it's kind of like this area is ours, and the English flag thing feels like it's a kind of reaction to that.
Mm-hmm.
And so Starmer has to say, oh well, I love the English flag, but I always put. He said, I think he mentioned the women's football, but it's obviously different. Having an English flag during the football is different to having it in a kind of area of white flight on the edge of a city which is heavily Muslim. But there, it might look like a territorial thing in a different way. And obviously having an English flag when England women's football were playing, that's very progressive. So a flag has a different meaning. So if you go to Sloane Square, there'll be flags, Union Jacks everywhere, partly because it's like swinging London. It's like people come here because they want to see where the King's Road and all that.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously it's different than the Shankill Road. But if you see it, Union Jack there, it means something completely different. And so it has much more of a sort of territorial feel, which people will know from Northern Ireland. I mean, I think some of them have even talked about putting up murals now, will be the next one. So, which will make it more colourful, I suppose. But it's not... If you go to Northern Ireland, when you get out of an area where there are flags either side, it's like when you're in a flag area, it's like, you're just tense, think, am I going to get beaten up? And then you go to an area where there are no flags because it's a middle-class area where everyone's fine and not involved in politics. Yeah. You just feel immense relief. Right. It's not necessarily a great sign for society where it has flags hanging up.
Mm. Is it Ulsterisation? That's how some have categorised it.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, I mean, we're a long way from Ulster. Ulster's had like such a, there was a long history of kind of conflict before it happened. I don't think we're anywhere near there, but I mean, I would suspect the flags are probably going to stay up. I mean, there's a lot of people putting them up, and when people take them down, they put them up again. Mm-hmm. And it does feel that, if you feel that, oh, my nationality, my country, they're kind of slipping away from me, and they're ruled by people who view the global well-being more important than my own well-being, and someone takes down the flag, your own national flag, that does only reinforce it. So there's even though you might understand why someone would reject the flag, there's no real logical way they say I object to the flag of this country I'm living in.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so of course the protests, and to a large extent the flags as well, are focused on this issue of illegal migration, and I think there's many reasons for that, in that it's so visible. The asylum hotels are such a bizarre thing to have in any town, and they can really become a focus of a lot of this sentiment. But as you mentioned earlier, actually the immigration figures we've had, the vast amount of demographic change is not mostly because of illegal migration. Right. It's mostly because of various kinds of chain migration.
Boris Johnson,
and the,
say the name.
Boris Johnson wave, exactly.
Yeah.
And I wondered, to what extent do you think, while yes, illegal migration has been the focus, we know, for instance, that actually the public thinks that the vast majority of recent immigration has been illegal.
Yeah, I mean, the public are, if you look at data, their awareness of statistics. I mean, most people, without sounding snobbish, most people that aren't aware of statistics,
yes. But so, do you think this is also carrying with it a lot of anger about legal migration?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The numbers just accelerated. Heady rates. There was numbers, increased from 98, 99, and then they sort of slowly go up, and then go up a lot, and then lockdown stops, and then suddenly it just, and this happens everywhere in the Western world. Every single country does it. So it wasn't, some people have said, oh, this is because of Brexit. It's like, that's kind of stretching it a little bit. I mean, there was an idea amongst the Conservative Party that people just had, control. If we were actually in charge, people wouldn't mind huge numbers. It's just insane thing to think. but the response after the sort of brief labour shortage, I mean, I don't know if you remember, but after, the hospitality industry started getting very agitated in 2020, so, we're running out of workers. I remember I think we were going to like a restaurant or a pub, but it was outdoors, I think. I don't know, I seem to remember maybe we were wearing masks or something weird. It was 2020, and the waitress, a local girl, said she'd been offered 3 jobs that week, and our wages were going up like anything.
Mm-hmm.
And there was sort of panic about that. So we're going to run out of, cheap workers. And so they just turned on everything. Partly they misunderstood how their own measurements, their own sort of, bars would actually, how many people could be able to come there. Partly it was just sort of, we've got to get more people. And they very much accelerated. And it was, I think, noticeable in, in just small towns where you just suddenly, the demography of the place completely changed in a way that people didn't really expect, and that's certainly I think that undoubtedly led to the Reform Party's rise and to the kind of general shift. Well, I wouldn't say a shift in the public's view of like multiculturalism and whatever. I would say the public have become much more agitated about immigration generally. It's gone up as a polling issue, and I think the right have become much more I suppose like radicalised on the issue. And that's definitely a result of that huge influx, which is, with immigration, it's very hard to control without making lots of kind of taking a big hit to start with. If you reduce the number of care workers, it would be noticeable. You would have bad headlines, you'd have individual tragedies. You'd have old people who might not have anyone to look after them. Once the economy would start to take that into account, wages would go up. You don't need to depend on them full time, but to make the initial decision is hard, and politicians don't. It's the hardest thing to do. The first thing, it's much easier just to sort of continually keep that tap kind of flowing, but it's not sustainable. And I think there is definitely a heightened anxiety among a lot of people that Britain is changing beyond anything we ever wanted, beyond anything anyone told us was going to happen. Again, and fueled probably by the October 7th attacks and the protests that happened after that would kind of increase that anxiety.
Absolutely. Okay, and so, not unrelated to that actually, so it's the question of the flag, it's the question of identity and all of this, and multiculturalism, and of course one way that the really cultural elites, let's say, like to sort of shore up that view of the world that actually a lot of people are quite not so happy with anymore, let's say, it is by putting it into our cultural programming, and in particular in TV, and we see the thing of colourblind casting in historical dramas in particular. And I know this is something that particularly bugs you, but I suppose I'll put.
Why do you even care?
Well, exactly. I'll put that question to you because that's the typical sort of left-wing response. Well, why does it matter whether a particular character in Wolf Hall or anything is the right race? Can't we just be tolerant? Why do you care, Ed?
Why do I care? It's called colourblind casting, but it's obviously very colour conscious. Mm-hmm. It wouldn't be, for example, it wouldn't be done the other way around, because it would be seen as very insensitive. And people around the world often complain when, the Egyptians complain when Netflix portrayed Cleopatra as black. Michael Sheen said he didn't want English actors playing Welsh actors, even though he's played in some amazing performances as Englishmen. Everyone around the world feels slightly aggrieved when this happens. It's only in the West where we have these kind of strange, and it's deliberate. It's not just deliberate, but it's also done in a way which is obviously deliberate and supposed to be jarring. So with the recent King and Conqueror, you see several of the leading kind of Anglo-Saxon, both earls and even... I actually gave up after episode 3. But they play by black actors. It goes back to the Hollow Crown, which sort of started the practice. And it's particularly grating because, this is not theatre or musical or magical realism where it's all, where, liberties are taken with things like costumes, and there are sort of references to modern times, or there are sort of jokes within. These are things that are specifically supposed to be quite accurate. People... filmmakers always consult historical consultants these days. They spend a lot of attention to costumes, to settings, even to authentic accents in the Hollow Crown. The Percys had Northumbrian accents, which is all to add to the authenticity. And at the same time, they include characters who could not conceivably do that. It's an anachronism, a deliberate anachronism for political reasons. It should bother you. It bothers me on two levels. Firstly, I just care about accuracy. Firstly, it bothers me about people deliberately lying about history because it's just not true, and because societies and regimes which obviously lie about history always tend to be quite bad. It always has a kind of malign goal. And secondly, it's clear that it is part of an attempt to sort of, because if you change a country's past, you control its future. The idea was like Britain was always multicultural, therefore it will always be multicultural, and it always is multicultural. And if you are in any way criticise that, you are completely out of bounds of normal discourse. And for people, when you're portraying people's ancestors, to do that in a way anywhere else in the world would be considered like incredibly insulting and deliberately insulting. But uniquely in Britain and maybe a few other European countries, there's this kind of craze to sort of show how little we care about accuracy. It doesn't really matter. I think these things do matter, because if you're trying to deliberately spread propaganda to the population, it kind of shows a kind of contempt for them in a way. It's also just jarring, if you know a bit about history and you portray, there's like London, which is entirely multicultural in the way that London is now. So that didn't happen. But then if you bring it back to medieval England, it's beyond absurd. I mentioned the case where there was about Catholics hiding out in after the gunpowder plot, and they're in a safe house, and there's a black guy in the front. It's like wouldn't you want to be conspicuous? Like, this might make you stand out a little bit. Or there's a film in Munich, which is set in 1940, and an actress is played by an Asian actress, and she sort of makes a joke about, I'm actually from Nottingham, and the joke doesn't make sense in its own sense, because that joke would only make sense in the 1970s or 1980s, when people were getting used to Asian people with British accents. It only makes sense if the people making the film assume people think Britain was multicultural in 1940. And this made me think, because I talked about Victorian times with my daughter when she was about 11, and she said, why are all the sort of prime ministers and leading figures in the period white? I said, obviously, apart from Mary Seacole, who she'd already learned about 15 times at school. I said, what do you mean? I said, well, where are all the sort of black and Asian people? I said, well, there were hardly any. I mean, until 1948, it was a very small population. She said, I thought it was the same as now. I said, and like every TV show she'd watched portrays it like that. So it's kind of understandable. And that kind of basic level thought, you're really sort of lying to a younger generation about their past. And that is, again, that's a sign of...
well, the propaganda is working in that case. I mean, of course, yeah.
I mean, most people... And I think it matters now, because I think the ready availability of English history to most people is not there. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are history nuts and history fanatics, but most of the public wouldn't know, I mean, beyond maybe the Tudors and the Second World War as the kind of the great moral analogy of our age, wouldn't know those things. I bet if you asked people under the age of 25 what percentage thought there was segregation and slavery in Britain, I bet you'd find a very large proportion, because they have so much American history pumped into them that they wouldn't know that slavery wasn't around in Britain, and that we didn't have segregation because we didn't have that much of a non-European population. And yeah, I mean, this is, as I say, this is what happens in quite bad regimes. So I just think it's a very kind of lamentable development.
Yes, and I suppose to tie that into the broad topic here, I mean, it's a very ahistorical view, isn't it, that actually ethnicity is just sort of, it's the skin colour you happen to be, and it's not really very relevant in history or politics, in human affairs. And it's actually, no, this is very central, and our society would have been very, very different if it had been multiracial for hundreds of years and things.
Sure,
like
it's
this.
Completely ahistorical. It's historians try to get into the mindsets of people in the past and try not to make sort of modern judgments about them, and often when it comes to their beliefs or their religion or something, and to try to present Even like Robert the Bruce, there is said Berwick 1310, and there's just a group of black people walking around. It's like, this is it's obviously, so it's supposed to work on two levels. If for a lot of the population, they probably won't think about it, or they would just think that was normal. But for people who are aware of history, it's deliberately kind of jarring to them, and it feels like it is making a statement. Like the authorities, we have certain beliefs, and if you don't have those beliefs, then we're going to rub in your face, basically.
Yeah.
Which is just bizarre. Like no other group in the world. I mentioned the most obvious, bad casting, John Wayne as Genghis Khan. I think the Mongols would be quite upset, and rightly so, if that happened now, because it's not just offensive, but it's also absurd. As a viewer, you cannot immerse yourself and not notice this is like an American guy of British ancestry in a completely wrong role. And if a director or actor stops you from immersing yourself, then they have failed as their job. You are supposed to think this guy is that person. And if they make efforts to stop you immersing yourself, then it can only be for obviously political reasons.
And so, if we tie this into the broader political reasons and kind of ideology of the regime that this speaks to go back to the human rights question and the illegal migration question and all of this, it seems to me to be this essentially deluded idea that ethnicity doesn't matter. We are not a sort of a nation state based around a particular ethnic group, and that this has been very important throughout our history, and that massive ethnic change is going to create a lot of problems, and that yes, they can, as you say, they can try and sort of convince people that it was always like this, but it wasn't. And the more we operate in a political system where we pretend that this isn't actually quite abnormal historically to have a society like this, it's not going to be tenable.
It was fine. It was it was a noble line. It worked. Well, it worked, and it was workable at a certain point. But it obviously becomes harder to function as diversity increases, as the majority group start to shrink, and as different competing identities and ancestries start. Lots of if you look at societies where things start falling apart for sort of over sectarian or racial issues, the past is totally poisonous, and people start competing over the past about whose country who was here first. Those are the issues that inevitably makes things worse. I think making the way they make British history an area to compete with is only going to make the issue more inflamed, rather than just recognizing a massive rupture basically happened in the late 20th century. This is, most, people a lot of people didn't have ancestors. They joined the story late. That doesn't mean they're not part of the story, but to try to sort of retrofit that so that everyone can claim the past is just. I feel that people don't think these things through. It's an idea. It's how good is that gonna what's the best outcome of that? And as you say, this is something that's very very unusual and new, and it's a sort of social experiment. And the further it goes on and the more it develops, the more difficult it is to find a happy outcome. I do wish. I've noticed I went on Blue Sky yesterday. I haven't been for ages because it's just mental. And people were complaining about Elon Musk is basically normalizing racism, and he's kind of given voice to lots of extreme figures. And they're true. They're correct. I think he's now tweeting some quite extreme stuff. But I wish there was an understanding that yes, that taboo is good to have that taboo in place. It's to help social order and to stop violence. But I wish you'd made a reasonable compromise yourselves, you guys, and just said if this is going to work, we've got to stick the brakes on now. We have got to find some stability and not encourage other forms of competing nationalisms in the country, which are inevitably going to trigger a response from the majority. But there are very few people who are willing to make those kind of compromises to sort of have a kind of sensible, moderate outcome. And, the result feels like two kind of polarizing groups on the issue.
Well, I think that's all we've got time for. Ed West, thank you very much for coming on the Sceptic.
Having me.
I'm very pleased to be joined today by Stephen Tucker, who is a regular columnist for the Daily Sceptic and the author of several books, including Hitler and Stalin's Misuse of Science. Welcome, Stephen.
Hello, I'm glad to be on again. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, good to have you here. So there's quite a few interesting and quite bizarre stories, and some of them quite disturbing as well for us to get into today, Stephen. But this first one, it really leads into this article that you've written. So we know the environmentalist types are obsessed with vegetarianism in particular because they think it's going to save the planet. And so much so that there's been a push to try and make people allergic to meat by infecting them with tick bites. I mean, is that right? This seems absolutely extraordinary, Steve. I mean, just tell us about this.
Yeah. Well, this is a story which was reported on the Daily Sceptic previously by a kind of environmental correspondent, Chris Morrison. And this was about two professors in America at Western Michigan University. There was Assistant Professor Blake Herath, who was the junior partner, and Professor Parker Crutchfield, who was the Dr. Frankenstein to the kind of subordinate Igor of Blake Herath. And they really did have a plan, which sounds completely made up and invented, but they really did have a plan whereby there's a type of tick called a Lone Star tick, which sounds a very American name for a parasite. And it appears to be possible to genetically modify it to allow it to spread a condition called AGS, I think it was called, which can have side effects of creating potentially allergic reactions to meat or to dairy products, or, and I'm sure this is just a minor side effect, also certain medicines. So there's not much that can go wrong there, is there? So
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.